Hello YouTube, welcome to FSX Genius and the very first video in my flight school series of tutorials that I'm going to be doing. And this tutorial series is going to go on for months and months and months. We're going to go from really basic, this is an aircraft, what does it do, how does it fly, to full-on in-depth tutorials on really advanced aircraft and every stage in between, including navigation and flight plans. Before we get started, I need you to download a program if you haven't already got it. Go to your preferred web browser and type in FS Commander, and at the top of the list you've got Flight Sim Commander. Download the latest version and install to your system. FS Commander comes as a free trial. Now that trial is a fully functioning, fully working program that only lasts for 30 minutes, and then it will say your time's run out, but you can immediately close it and restart it. It's up to you whether or not you then want to go on and buy the licensed version, which doesn't close. And what is FS Commander? Well, it's a flight planning, flight data integrated system that runs in conjunction with your FSX files, and this is good because we're going to use it to help us visualize our flights and our flight plans. We're not going to go into the in-depth advanced functions of FS Commander, but we are going to use it so that we can have a look at a flight plan and say, oh yeah, I can see there that I fly north and turn east or turn west, and that's why we're using it. And the beauty of this program is it uses FSX's own database, scenery and airport files. So once you've installed it, in order for FS Commander to know which files it's looking at and how to use those files correctly, we'll end up with two icons. The first is the launch icon. Now you will end up with three. One will say FSX P3D, one will say FSC P3D, FSC FS 2004 and FSC FSX. You can delete the other two shortcuts. You just want the Flight Sim Commander for FSX and Flight Sim Commander Database Manager. Make sure you've got those two left on your screen and you can delete the other two shortcuts to your recycle bin. Before we even launch before we even launch Flight Sim Commander, we need to launch the FSC Database Manager. You need to point in this box here Flight Sim Commander to your FSX file. Now for you that's probably in C, Program Files x86, Microsoft Games and then FSX. Once you've highlighted that folder you will say you have correctly chosen the path for your FSX. Press the update button now and we click that. What this is doing now is it's reading all of the scenery files and all of the airport information files that are contained within Flight Simulator X and putting those into its map and navigation and flight planning software. And you can see now that Flight Sim Commander has correctly installed and updated all of its scenery and database files and its airport files, and is working now in perfect harmony with your Flight Simulator X. So we can close that window now that the updates have been completed. So let's open the program and I'll just give you a basic rundown of what we're going to do with it and how we're going to use it. So this is the first screen that you're going to see as soon as Flight Sim Commander loads up, and this is just asking you to give you its starting point. What airport do you want to start at on the map so that you're not scrolling around looking for it. Let's pick Birmingham, which is Echo Golf Bravo Bravo, and click on Search by ICAO. That gives you Birmingham, and select, and it will open up the map screen. Now here in the map screen we have quite a lot of information, a lot of things showing. Now we can turn on and off various parts of the map, and we can also zoom out and zoom in. And you can see that Birmingham is centred on our screen there. You can also see around the outside is a compass ring starting at 0 degrees all the way through to east at 90, south at 180 degrees, west at 270 degrees, and all the way back to north at 0 or 360. It's the same thing on a compass. You can see that there are two runways at Birmingham that it's identified using these arrows, I want to talk about the runways themselves and why have they got numbers. Birmingham's got runway 15 and also runway 33. Runways get their numbers depending on which way they're pointing in relation to this compass that we visualise over the top of the airport. Here, runway 33, imagine we're approaching runway 33 and continue this arrow all the way through, and you can see that it lines up with 330 degrees on the compass. Coming in the opposite direction, runway 15 lines up with 150 degrees on the compass. It's useful to know because it gives you an idea when they give you a runway in which direction you're landing in, based on the direction that you're travelling at the moment. So you'll know whether or not you need to turn left or right to line up with the runway, and it gives you a good idea in your head of where you need to be to line up with that runway properly. Something else we also take into consideration when choosing a runway to take off from or land at is that we should always be landing into the wind as much as possible. Now, quite often we may get circumstances where the wind's coming in sideways, in which case we've got to make a decision, or we will be told which runway to land at by air traffic control if we're at that advanced stage where we're flying with air traffic control. Flight Sim Commander has a useful tool. If we go up here to the weather option and show weather, it will download latest weather information that's available online and give you an arrow showing you which direction the wind is blowing in. When you are given wind information, you will be given it as a heading and also a speed. So when somebody gives you wind information like that, they will tell you the direction the wind is coming from and not the direction the wind is going to. In this case, they may say to you that the wind is coming from 220 degrees at 6 knots. So that's where it's coming from, not where it's going to. It's important to remember this because you're going to try and land into the wind as much as possible. As you can see here, our choice of runway for this landing would be runway 15. The reason for this is 15 or 150 degrees is closer to 200 than 33 degrees. Quite hard to understand unless you get the concept of runway numbers are given in the direction that you're going, whereas wind information is given in the direction it's coming from. So there we go, that's runways. Why do we have those numbers? Because that's the direction that the runway is pointing in. It helps us to visualise it. If we're using a compass, we know that we need to be flying in a certain direction to land on that runway. Wind information, we always try and take off and land into the wind. So we choose a runway where the runway number as closely as possible matches the wind direction number. In a perfect world, if the wind was from 150 degrees, we would take off on runway 15 because that's pointing in the direction of 150 or 150 degrees. So here we are now, we're at Sherburn in Elmer, which is an airport near York, and we're going to go through some of the basic flight principles of this light aircraft, which is a Cessna C172. Now, from a simulation point of view, it's important that you've set your controllers up correctly. First thing I would recommend you do is go to the Options, Settings, Controls and find your particular controller, which will be your joystick, and click on Calibrate. Properties, Settings, and for me Calibrate, and we're going to calibrate my flight controller. We move the controller in full circles through its full range of movement, backwards, forwards, left and right. I also need to calibrate the throttle axis, my flaps axis and my mixture axis. Now for you, you may just have a basic forwards, backwards, left and right and a throttle control on the joystick. I'm using the Satec ProFlight yoke system, so things will be different from me as they are for you unless you're using the same setup. Once we're done, we click Finish, Apply, OK, OK and OK again, and get back into the cockpit. There are a few controls that I need you to be aware of where they are. The first is the flaps control. Now this is flaps up and flaps down in increments using your F6 and F7 keys. You also need to assign keys, if they're not already assigned, to your trim up and trim down, and that's elevator trim up and elevator trim down, and we'll discuss the importance of those in a little while. You need to trim the aircraft during flight. You don't just want to put it in autopilot and maintain an altitude of X thousand feet. You want to be able to fly at a speed, at a heading, and without climbing or diving or having to fight the controls. The aircraft, you should be able to take the hands off the controls and let it fly itself, and that is what we use trim for. All aircraft have trim. All aircraft need to be trimmed in order to fly most efficiently. Again, that's something we'll discuss shortly, but let's have a quick look around the cockpit. This section here is your radios. Your radios are in two parts: communication radios, COM1 and COM2, that's for talking to air traffic control, and navigation radios, which we'll go into in a lot more detail in later tutorials. The main thing that we're going to concentrate on in the first few tutorials is the autopilot section. However, again, that's something we're not going to use in this particular tutorial today. We're just going to discuss how the aircraft works and how it flies. Here you can see all the dials that we've got, and we're going to discuss these in a little detail. This is an important one for us. It's the airspeed indicator. And the airspeed indicator, as it says, indicates our speed through the air. That's not the same as our ground speed. Let me try and explain. Let's try and understand the difference between airspeed and ground speed. In order for an aircraft to fly, the air flowing over the wings has to be at a certain speed to generate enough lift to keep it in the sky. The speed of the air over the wings is what we're going to refer to as airspeed. In this picture you can see on the screen the aircraft is flying level-ish at 3,000 feet. And in order to maintain a good flight, we want the airspeed to be at around 100 knots. Airspeed and ground speed in aviation is measured in knots and not miles per hour. So here we're going to see we want 100 knots maintained airspeed. However, depending on the weather conditions, that will determine what your ground speed will be as well. I'll try and explain. On a perfectly calm day with no headwind or tailwind, we can maintain 100 knots airspeed by flying forwards at 100 knots. Because we've got no other forces acting on the plane, our ground speed will also be 100 knots. Now we will add to the equation a headwind. The headwind will be coming in at 20 knots. So in order for us to maintain an airspeed of 100 knots, we will need to be moving forward at a speed of 80 knots. The 80 knots plus the headwind of 20 knots gives us a total airspeed of 100 knots. So the airspeed's 100 knots, but we are only moving forwards at 80 knots. So our ground speed is 80 knots. Let's now take that example to its extreme. We need to maintain an airspeed of 100 knots. However, unrealistically, we have a headwind of 100 knots. Therefore, the speed of the air going over our wings is 100 knots. However, as we have maintained our airspeed and had to apply no forward thrust to keep that wind going over our wings at 100 knots, our ground speed would actually be 0. We are getting enough lift from the 100 knot headwind to keep us in the air, but without actually moving forwards. So what happens when we get a tailwind? When we have a tailwind, let's assume the wind is blowing from behind at 20 knots. In order for us to generate air over the wing, an airspeed of 100 knots, we would have to move forward through the air at 120 knots. The reason being is that the tailwind is deducted from our forward speed to give us our airspeed. In this example, a tailwind of 20 knots would mean we would have to fly at 120 knots to maintain an airspeed of 100 knots. Therefore our ground speed over the ground is the same as our forward speed, 120 knots. Managing your airspeed is critical and far more important than managing ground speed. It's entirely dependent on the direction of the wind, whether you're flying into the wind or with the wind, but it's best to maintain an airspeed at which the aircraft is stable and flying efficiently. So back to the cockpit, we're going to have a look around and have a look at some of the other dials and what they do. I suppose an important one to take a look at is the altimeter. That tells us how high we are, and this is this dial here at the moment. So the little hand refers to the thousands of feet, and the big hand is the hundreds of feet. So as you climb, it will do a full circuit, and this little hand will move to 1000, then another full circuit, and then to 2000. Now you can see a little figure here, 29.9. In order to gauge its altitude above the ground, it uses what we call barometric pressure. The closer to ground level you are, the higher the pressure, and the higher you get, the less air pressure there is. Now the thing is, that pressure changes depending on weather conditions. So for instance, on a nice warm sunny day, the air pressure may be a little bit less than it is on a cold winter's day when the air is more dense. There are lots of factors that change air pressure. However, when we start at an airport, we need to tune our altimeter to the pressure at that airport at that time on that day. Now thankfully FSX has got a trick for doing that. If you press the B key on your keyboard, watch what happens to the dial. It's currently reading about 2,100 feet, but if we press B, it brings it back to 0 feet, or just short of 0 feet. The actual airport is slightly above sea level, so we're 30 feet above sea level, and you can see that the figure has changed to 29.7. So that now is correct. And whenever we're approaching an airport or taking off, we're going to press B on our keyboard to make sure that we've got the right barometric setting in, so that it gives us an accurate altitude. Just below that is our vertical speed, and that indicates how fast we are climbing or descending. A lot of people who have been on FSX for a while and have never really understood this might benefit from listening to this part. When we're in an aircraft and we take off from the runway, we don't want to set ourselves a target of climbing at 1,000 feet a minute and just keep it nailed at that. On the autopilot, people often set a vertical speed in here and select autopilot on, but the problem is that the aircraft wants to maintain a speed rather than maintaining a climb rate. So when we take off, we're going to get it up to about 90 knots, and we're going to actually pitch the nose up or down in order to maintain that speed. So our vertical speed, the rate at which we're climbing, is going to vary, but our climb speed will remain the same. And those two things go hand in hand, and it's the same on the way down as well. But we'll get into that when we start talking about flying a little bit more. Now I just wanted to go down here, and this here is what we call the trim wheel. And if you remember at the start I said you need to set some keys to make sure that you can adjust your elevator trim up and down, and they are set, I think it's number pad 1 and 7, but you're best setting your own so they're easily there. And we're going to use trim to keep the aircraft flying level when we're flying manually. See, what happens is, as you fly, if you increase power, the aircraft will want to climb as the airspeed increases over the wings, and you want to stop it doing that. And as you decrease power, the aircraft is going to want to descend. So we use trim to make sure the aircraft is aligned in such a way that it maintains level flight, but you can increase or decrease your speed. And I'm going to demonstrate that now for you. So we're in the cockpit, and as you can see in the display here, we're at about 1,400 feet, and at the moment we're flying level. I have used my trim up and down to establish a nice level flight, and you can see here that we're at about 100 knots. And the trim you need to be on top of all the time, because varying wind conditions will make it so that your aircraft will try and climb and descend a little bit, and every time you climb and descend you will lose or gain speed. Now, to give you an example of why we need to trim the aircraft, I'm just going to increase the power, and I want you to keep an eye on the vertical speed gauge. So I'm increasing power now, and you can see that we immediately start to climb. So it's now up to us to trim the aircraft back down so that it will fly level again. The reverse of that, as you can see, sorry, just before I continue, you can see that the airspeed is increasing now, and we're just trimming the aircraft to stay as close to that 0 mark as possible. And until your airspeed levels out, you're going to have to continually keep adjusting the trim. So there we are, 1,500 feet, and we've trimmed the aircraft for level flight again. And now watch what happens when we decrease the power. If I come back to about 75% thrust or 75% RPM, the aircraft immediately starts to descend. Now this is a useful trick to be aware of when you're approaching the airport. You can use your thrust to dictate how slowly or how fast you descend through the air through your vertical speed. So rather than pushing forwards and backwards on the controls, we're just gently tweaking the throttles until we get the correct vertical speed displayed. So that's why trim is so important. Quite often people try flying without trim set and they end up fighting the controls. Now as this is coming down to 1,000 feet, we're going to re-trim the aircraft using the trim up and down buttons that we've got assigned to level off at 1,000 feet. And we've not actually changed the throttle position at all, but the speed will slowly start to come down. As the speed does come down, it will want to descend, so we continue to trim the aircraft to keep it at 1,000 feet. The speed's now levelled off at about 100 knots, and the aircraft is trimmed accordingly, and we're maintaining 1,000 feet and neither climbing nor descending. While we have the aircraft in the air, I'm going to have a look at the next dial that is quite important to us, and that is this dial in the centre, which is our heading. The arrow points to the heading that we're flying at the moment. So right now you can see we're flying at a heading of 251. As we turn the aircraft, this will also turn. We're now making a turn to the left, and you can see that the heading is turning and the arrow's pointing to the direction that we're flying as we turn. And you can see the heading is reducing to 40. Down to 230. And one final thing that I want to look at is here, which is the turn indicator. You can see that at the moment we're flying level. The wings line up with the 2 marks on either side. Below the left and right is what we call the maximum bank angle, or the maximum turn rate. When we turn the aircraft, we don't want our wing to pass this point, which will demonstrate. That is about the maximum amount of turn for this particular aircraft. Anything beyond that and the aircraft will become unstable in the air, so it's a good idea just to keep an eye on your turn rate, just to make sure that you're not exceeding that. You don't really want to fall out of the skies at this stage. One more instrument to look at is what we call our artificial horizon. This gives us our attitude, in other words, our position relative to the ground, whether we're climbing, banking or descending. As we turn, you'll see the attitude indicator turns with the aircraft. It also has lines indicating your maximum turn rate. Also, if we increase power and begin to climb, you can see that our horizon drops and our nose is pointing up as indicated by the yellow dot in the centre, and we're climbing at a rate of about 1,000 feet a minute. These are all visual aids to help you establish whether the aircraft is flying straight and level, climbing or descending. Let's open Flight Sim Commander and we're going to go to Leeds Bradford Airport. Now the airport code is Echo Golf November Mike, and select. And you can see that it's centred on Leeds Bradford Airport, and I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. We're also going to show the weather, so we can choose from here which runway we're going to take off from. And it's very much a crosswind here, so I'm going to take off today from runway 32. Also, if you go to the side here, we are going to have a look at a very simple form of navigation a little bit later in the flight. Make sure that you click on NDB, and that stands for a non-directional beacon, and virtually every airport, as you can see, has one. And you can always tell NDBs in the UK because they have a frequency of between 300 and 700, and the other types of navigation systems, which are known as VORs, all start with a 1. So we just want to find the NDB, the non-directional beacon, and we'll discuss that a little bit more and make a note of the frequency, which is 402.5. With that information, we can now close Flight Sim Commander and launch Flight Simulator X. When we get to the free flight page, we need to go first of all select our airport, which will be Echo Golf November Mike, and the plane. The aircraft that we're flying today is going to be, as we have been in all of this tutorial, the Cessna C172SP, and click OK. That is a standard aircraft that comes with Flight Simulator X, so you'll all have that one. The airport ID was Echo Golf November Mike, and we are going to start on runway 32. We're also going to land at runway 32. Under normal circumstances, if you were flying online or with other people, I would never ever recommend starting on the runway. I would recommend starting your flight with you either in a parking area or at a gate, but that's something for the next tutorial when we discuss taxiing and airport movement. This is just about our first basic flight. And click OK. We'll also just need to reset the time, and we can fly now. So we're all ready to go on runway 32 at Leeds Bradford Airport, but we just need to do a few things to set the aircraft up. For me to view these, I'm using a system called EasyDock, which is set up for my aircraft. It's a dedicated camera system which allows me to move through different views in the cockpit. However, you can use either F9 or F10 on your keyboard to switch between 2D cockpit mode and 3D cockpit mode. Alternatively, if you click here and click on cockpit, you can look at light switches, radio stack, right seat, virtual cockpit, etc. Now we need to set our lights. It's important that when we're on our takeoff or landing procedure, we switch the landing lights on. The taxi lights can remain off for now, but we do need navigation and strobe lights on. The other thing we'll look at here is, this is our trim wheel, and we're going to use our trim button to set our trim to the takeoff setting, and that will stop us fighting the controls as we actually begin takeoff with the aircraft. We also want to press B on our keyboard, B for Bravo, to reset the altimeter to the correct local altimeter readings. Leeds Bradford Airport is actually located on top of a hill and is at an altitude of nearly 700 feet, so that's correct. The final thing we want to do is we're not going to engage the autopilot until we are at our cruising altitude, but we want to set our altitude using our mouse button. So you can see if we go to the left it's minus, if we go to the right it's plus. Stay away from vertical speed, we're going to ignore that for the moment, but altitude here, we're going to set that to 2,000 feet. And you can use your mouse wheel to scroll up to 2,000 feet if that's the way you want to do it. And last but not least, I'll just adjust my view down here, we want to set our takeoff flaps to the first setting. You can either use this button here, or you can use F6 and F7 to make the flaps go down and up. So F7 will take it up one notch. When we do that, the flaps on the wings will come down slightly to give us a greater surface area to reduce our takeoff speed. So let's just knock that down one notch, and if you watch here outside you'll see the flaps come down. And that's our flaps 1 set. So what we're going to do? Well, we're going to slowly increase power up to full power. When our speed indicates 60 knots, we're going to gently start pulling back on the stick. And we're going to watch this vertical speed indicator, and we're not going to let it go above 500. And what we are going to do is we are going to adjust our trim so that the needle will continue to rise, and we want it to level off at about 80 knots. Once it's done that, we maintain 80 knots using our up and down elevator trim. So we're going to be climbing at 80 knots, not concentrating on the vertical speed rate at all. We just want to maintain 80 knots. And as we get close to 2,000 feet, we're going to press AP to engage the autopilot, and Alt, which is the altitude. It will hold the altitude that you've set, which is 2,000 feet. So let's begin our takeoff roll. Remember, use your rudders on the runway to keep yourself in a nice straight line as you go through the takeoff procedure. So I'm slowly increasing power now, up to full power. At 60 knots I can start to pull back on the stick and gently take off. And when keeping an eye on that vertical speed, we're not going to exceed 500 knots, 500 feet a minute, and we're keeping an eye on our speed, and when that gets to 80 knots we're going to adjust the trim so that it continues to climb at 80 knots. So at the moment it was starting to slow down, so I've started to nose down with the trim, and now that we've cleared the runway, we're going to bring our flaps back to the up position. And we are maintaining 80 knots. At this stage we're not making any turns, we're just flying away from the airport in the direction that we took off from, trying to maintain 80 knots with our trim, and keeping an eye open for when we get close to this 2,000 feet. We've got 500 feet to go, so I'm going to start to nose down a little bit, and now we don't have to concentrate on the speed so much, we're concentrating on making the aircraft fly level at 2,000 feet. 250 feet to go. Starting to bring the nose down a little bit. Just using trim, I'm not making any movements on the controls. And there we are at 2,000 feet, and we trim the aircraft down to level flight now. And this is where we need to be quite balanced in our approach. We want to maintain 2,000 feet. So we're going to select autopilot on and altitude select, and the aircraft will maintain 2,000 feet. But you can see what's happening is now that we've levelled out, the speed is starting to climb. So we're going to slowly reduce our throttles just a little bit to maintain about 100 knots. So we're a little bit fast at the moment. And that's just about perfect. So what now? Well, at the moment, because we're in this autopilot altitude, you may find that even if we turn the controls, the aircraft doesn't do anything, and this is a little bit of a bug within FSX. On your autopilot panel, click heading twice to engage it and then disengage it, and then you'll be able to turn the aircraft whilst maintaining 2,000 feet. And now you can see the aircraft turns and responds with our inputs. So we're going to make a left hand turn, and what we're doing is we're keeping an eye on our dial here, making sure that our wingtip doesn't exceed that maximum turn. Doesn't matter which direction you're turning, we just want to make a nice steady turn. Always keep an eye on your speed, try and maintain that 100 knots. Remember, when you're turning, you're putting a little bit of extra stress on the airframe, on the aircraft itself, so it will try and slow it down a little bit. And let's level off. Now you can fly around as much as you want to, but there is going to come a point when you want to get back to the airport. Now if you've lost sight of the airport, this is why I asked you to write down the NDB, or the non-directional beacon, which is located at the airport. If we go to our autopilot panel and we look here at ADF, and this is something called an automatic direction finder, and we set these numbers to the beacon which is located at Leeds Bradford Airport, and keep an eye on this dial here. You have to click on each number individually to set it. So the first one we set to 4, 0, 2.5. And did you see what happened? The needle spun around. Now all we have to do in order to fly to the airport is simply turn our aircraft until this needle points to here. Alternatively, what we can do, if you look at our heading here, and you can see that we're not using the heading autopilot at the moment, but if we set it to where we're pointing, we're at a heading of 165. If we set heading 165 here, .50, 160, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The arrow is pointing to the east. So what we would do is turn until we were flying east, and that arrow would then line up with here. So let's try that. We're going to turn the aircraft until this arrow lines up with this mark. Remember, our turn, we're not going to exceed our maximum bank angle. And the arrow lines up, we will level out. and we're now flying straight towards the beacon, the marker at the airport. Now this is only good for when you're about 30 miles away from the airport. You can see the airport's passing underneath us now, and as we pass over the airport, watch what happens to the ADF needle. See that now we've gone beyond the airport, the needle's starting to spin around and we'll end up pointing behind us. That's because the airport's behind us, and if we want to get back to the airport we need to turn and follow the needle again. So we've been flying around now for a little while, and we've been flying away from the airport. We've been maintaining 2,000 feet by using the altitude hold section of the autopilot, and we've also been maintaining 100 knots by carefully controlling our throttles. But now we want to get back to the airport and land, so we need to think about our approach procedure. Let me explain how we approach and land at an airport when we are flying visually. So back at our Flight Sim Commander, we've got an overhead view of Leeds Bradford Airport, and we want to land at runway 32. What we want to do is first of all fly over the airport at, let's say, 2,000 feet. We will go through proper procedures using charts at later tutorials, but we're just going to do this visually and by eye and by hand for now. So imagining that we could be anywhere within the airport vicinity here, the first thing we need to do is fly back to the airport, and we will do that by using our NDB, non-directional beacon, and the ADF, automatic direction finder, to fly back to the airport. Once we've overflown the airport, we will continue our pass a little bit further, and then we want to make a turn so that we are going to fly parallel with the runway away from the airport. Once we've flown away from the airport for a couple of miles, we make a base turn, and then make our approach to the runway. And this is the same for all our approaches when we're flying visually. We overfly the airport first, turn and fly parallel away from the airport but parallel with the runway. This is our upwind leg. Then we will turn onto a base leg, and then onto our approach for the runway itself. Once we've on this approach, we need to be aware of how we're going to descend to the runway, and we will discuss that once we've overflown the airport and made these what we call procedural turns. Now this is the same for, it doesn't matter what direction you're flying in from. If we were to fly in from over here, we would overfly the airport and then turn away, parallel and away, base and back in. So first of all, let's make our turn so that we fly back towards the airport. Again, we want to maintain as close to 100 knots as possible, and not exceeding our rate of turn. Keep your eye on that needle for when it comes back round and lines up again. I can see it here in the corner of the screen. It's slightly hidden by my flight controls, it's just the way I've got my camera set up. However, I can keep a close eye on that, and I'll know when I'm lined up with the airport. And we're going to level out. And you can see the airport in the distance. Now, we need to know which way to turn in order to make our procedure turns. At the moment, we're flying at about 250 degrees. and we need to land on runway 32. So looking at our indicator here, we can see that 320 or 32 is over in this direction, so we know that once we fly over the airport, the runway runs in this direction, so we will need to actually turn in the opposite direction, which is left. We want to come in towards 32, so we actually need to be turning away and parallel in a heading of about 150, and we're going to fly that manually. Now we could overfly the airport and do a big circuit, or we could just actually make that turn left just before we get to the airport, so that we know we're flying away from the airport. So we'll do it that way. So this is the airport now, coming up, and this is runway 32 running from left to right. You can see that because that's in that direction, looking at 32 on our heading display. So let's make a left turn now and fly in the opposite direction, which is 150. We may be just a little bit close to the airport when we've made this turn, but we'll deal with it. Remember, this is all visual. And looking now, we're heading 150 or close enough, so we're actually flying in the opposite direction of the runway that we want to land at, and slightly off to the left. So we're going to continue flying in this direction at 2,000 feet for a few minutes to allow us to get far enough away from the airport so that we can make a good approach. As we're thinking about making our approach, now would be a good time to start reducing our speed. And we're going to bring our speed down to about 80 knots. We do this by reducing the throttle. And you see the speed starts to come down. We also want to apply stage 1 of flaps once we pass the edge of this grey indicator area here. So let the speed continue to come down by reducing throttle. And we'll apply stage 1 of flaps by pressing F7 once. Now the speed may decrease quite dramatically now, so we need to catch it with the power and try and maintain 80 knots. We're now far enough away from the airport as well to do our 180-degree turn to line us back up with runway 32, so we need to make that turn to the right now. And at this stage we are managing the power to maintain 80 knots and our rate of turn. Keep an eye on the heading, and as it starts to come round to 32 for runway 32, we can level out. And that is the airport down there. And we're going to turn off the autopilot make sure that we're on top of our trim. And make sure we're turning towards the airport so that we're going to line up with the runway. The aircraft's trying to climb a little bit, so we're going to keep hold of that. Now in the distance here you can see red and white lights. These are what we call our PAPI, or Pilot Approach Precision Instrument. If you've got all red lights, then you're too high. If you've got all red lights, you're too low. If you've got all white lights, you are too high. At the moment we've got red and white. And now they've got white, so we're too high. So we're going to reduce the throttle and start descending. You notice I said we're reducing the throttle to descend. We're not pushing forward on the stick. And we're going to control our rate of descent using the throttle. Again, we're too high, so we've reduced the throttle more to increase our descent rate. And as you can see, we're not lined up with the runway, so we're going to turn off to the left and then turn back to the right so that we do line up with the runway. Visual approaches are all about controlling the speed of the aircraft and the descent rate of the aircraft and making minor, small adjustments. I've increased my descent rate more by reducing the throttle more. And as we start to see the red lights appear again, which we are doing now, we bring the throttle back up just to keep our descent rate in check. Now as we're getting close to the airport, we need to think about bringing the speed down. So we're going to apply another stage of flaps by pressing F7. And you see the speed will come down. It's also had the effect of levelling us out again, and that's not what we want. We want to continue descending, so we need to control our throttle to make sure that we are descending at the right rate, keeping an eye on those lights ahead of us. And we want to aim to land this aircraft at about 60 knots. Anything faster than that is a little bit too fast, and you would risk damaging the aircraft. We've got 2 red lights and 2 white lights, which means that we are correctly descending towards the airport. And speed is 70 knots. What I'm going to do now is add one more stage of flaps. That will bring the speed down further, and as I've done that I have reduced the throttle even further. And we're getting a little bit low, so we need to bring the power back up again. Descent rate is coming back in line now. You can see we've got 1 light. We would prefer 1 more light. Once you cross the runway threshold, you can ignore the lights. It's entirely down to you visualising the runway and making sure you're touching down where you're supposed to. Small movements on the controls to keep yourself lined up. And as we're just about to touch down, we're going to back off the throttles completely and ease back on the controls. Just pulling back slightly, just to bring the nose up. and that's the wheels on the ground. And we use our brakes, which is the full stop button on the keyboard, to slow us down. And we have a taxiway on our left hand side here, so we're going to use that to exit the runway. Again, we're using our rudder pedals or rudder controls on our joystick to steer the aircraft. When taxiing these aircraft, keep your speed to an absolute minimum. Otherwise the aircraft will skid and slide on the tarmac as you try and turn it. And you can follow the yellow lines until you're clear of the runway and at a parking area. So that concludes our first lesson. We've downloaded and we've learned how to use Flight Sim Commander, or the most basic parts of Flight Sim Commander. We've looked at the controls within the aircraft itself. We've looked at how to set trim to allow us to fly level and stable. We've looked at the takeoff procedure, about how we manage the speed of the climb and not necessarily the rate of climb. We've looked at how to make some turns and how to maintain altitude using the autopilot's altitude function. We've learnt about how to make an approach to an airport. The approach done in such a way that you overfly the airport and then make a series of turns to bring you back and line you up with the runway. And I suggest that you go do that now and practice those procedures, and then you'll be ready for the next tutorial, in which we'll look at airport movement on the ground, so taxiways, and we'll be looking at some more advanced navigation and doing something called an ILS approach, or a VOR approach, which is where we actually use instruments in the aircraft itself to line us up with the runway so that we don't have to visually see the runway, and we can make a descent to the runway as well without having to worry too much about controlling the rate of descent. So that's what's coming up next. I hope you've taken something from this. Please leave your comments, ask any questions, and make sure if you don't subscribe already that you do subscribe to the channel. There's always something there for somebody. You can always learn something. And that's it for now. I'll see you for the next one, which will be up and online fairly shortly. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.